I had the marker in my hand before I even realized what I was doing. It was 1 a.m. The 42nd floor was empty, or it was supposed to be. The lights in Miss Whitfield's office were on, but the door was cracked and I could see she'd stepped away from her desk. I had maybe 2 minutes before she came back. The whiteboard was covered in code, dense, layered, the kind of architecture that takes a serious team weeks to map out. I recognized the framework the moment I saw it. Neural pathway stabilization. I'd built something like it myself 9 years ago. There was a section near the center that was wrong, not a small error. The kind of error that would cause the entire system to collapse under load. A recursive loop nobody on that floor had caught yet. I stood there. I told myself to keep walking. I didn't. I uncapped the marker, fixed the loop, recapped it, put it back in the tray, grabbed my cart, and walked out. 40 seconds, maybe less. My name is Miles Donovan. I'm 49 years old, and at that moment, I was a janitor who had just made the worst smart decision of his life. Let me back up. 3 years before that night, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in South Austin with my son Cole, who was 6 years old and had just been diagnosed with a progressive neural degradation syndrome. The kind doctors explain in careful voices with a lot of eye contact, because they know what they're about to say is going to take the air out of the room. The disease attacked the pathways in his brain, slowly at first, then faster. The standard treatment was a monthly infusion protocol that cost $14,000 a month and slowed the progression without stopping it. Managed decline. That's what they called it. The pharmaceutical company had a nicer term, but that's what it was. I knew there was another way. I had spent 6 years building it. Before Cole got sick, before any of this, I was chief research scientist at Nexus Biotech. I joined the company in my early 30s, back when Reed Whitfield was still running things. Reed was old school. He believed the point of a medical company was to actually cure people. He gave me a team, full funding, and the freedom to work. What I built was called Project Helix, a neural mapping algorithm that didn't just slow degradation, it reversed it. The early trials were more successful than anything we'd seen in the field. We were 18 months from submitting to the FDA, then Reed got sick, dementia, early stage, and Tanner Weston moved in. Tanner was the head of corporate security, but that title never captured what he actually did. What he actually did was manage the board. He'd been doing it quietly for years, long before Reed's illness gave him real leverage. By the time Reed couldn't track a conversation from start to finish, Tanner was the one walking documents into his office and walking them back out signed. One of those documents shut down Project Helix. Another one terminated my employment on the basis of a misconduct report I'd never seen and couldn't refute. By the time I understood what had happened, my badge didn't work, and my name had been scrubbed from the internal research directory. I spent 2 years fighting it through lawyers. I got nowhere. Tanner had covered his tracks well, so I changed my approach. I took a job on the Nexus night cleaning crew under the name Miles Brooks, not to steal anything. A janitor badge doesn't get you into secure systems. What it does get you is access to the building's infrastructure grid, including the secondary server cooling network that runs on a separate power circuit and isn't monitored by the main IT security team. I'd found the gap years earlier, back when I was designing the building's data architecture. A legacy loop in the cooling grid that nobody had patched because nobody knew it was there. I rented a barn 22 miles south of downtown Austin, out on a county road past the old grain elevators. Paid $1,400 a month under a shell company. Set up 4 server racks, 2 cooling units, and a medical monitoring station I'd assembled piece by piece over 18 months, sourcing components under 6 different vendor names. In the center of it all, inside a glass-paneled room I'd built myself, Cole slept most nights connected to a network of sensors and IV lines that I monitored remotely from my phone during the day and in person every night after my shift. The Helix algorithm needed more processing power than I could afford commercially, so I borrowed it. A few hours each night off the secondary grid while the building was empty. Not enough to trigger a usage flag, just enough to keep the system running. That was my life for 3 years. Then I picked up a marker at 1 a.m. and wrote on a classified whiteboard. I told myself it didn't matter. Nobody would know who did it. The camera in that hallway had a 15-degree blind spot I'd mapped in my first week on the job. What I didn't account for was the camera inside the office itself. I found out the next evening when I came in through the service entrance on B1 and noticed the parking structure camera on level B2 had been repositioned. New angle, pointed directly at the employee exit. Someone had reviewed the footage. I did my shift, skipped the 42nd floor, drove home the long way through the industrial district and back up through the warehouse corridor on Cesar Chavez, checked my mirrors at every light. I almost didn't see her, a plain gray sedan, parked dark behind a rusted container on the access road to the Hadley property. The silhouette behind the wheel was too upright for that neighborhood, too deliberate. Sloan Whitfield had followed me. I drove past without slowing, looped around the back of the property, parked behind the equipment shed on the east side, and went in through the side door. I had 72 hours of processing time left on the Helix upload, maybe less. I sat down at the console and got to work. What I didn't know was what Sloan did next. She sat in that sedan for a while after I drove past, long enough to decide something. Then she got out, walked across the gravel to the barn, and found the equipment delivery door on the south wall. I used it twice a week for supply runs. It latched from the inside, but the latch was worn. One firm pull and it opened. She slipped in without making a sound. What she saw stopped her cold. 4 server racks along the far wall, blinking green and blue in the dark. Fiber optic cables running across the concrete floor like black veins, all feeding into the medical station in the center of the room. And inside the glass-paneled enclosure, Cole, 9 years old, pale, connected to a network of sensors and IV lines, asleep under a thin hospital blanket. She stood there and didn't move for a long time. Then she saw the monitor above the main console. The Project Helix logo pulsing in the dark. A logo she didn't recognize. A logo that, as far as Nexus Biotech's official records were concerned, had never existed. She took photos with her phone, left the same way she came in, drove back to her penthouse and started making calls. By 6 a.m. she had her niece Nora on the phone. Nora Whitfield was 17 and finishing a summer internship in Nexus's Legacy Data Archive division. Boring work, she'd told Sloan 3 times that week. Scanning old folders, cataloging deleted partitions on servers that hadn't been active since 2015. Sloan told her exactly what to search for. Any folder tagged with the word Helix, on any pre-2017 server, regardless of deletion status. Nora found it in 4 hours. The folder was called Helix Oridae. It had been deleted, then overwritten, then deleted again, but the archive servers used a write protection protocol that Tanner's team apparently didn't know about. The data was still there, buried 3 partitions deep. Inside was everything. The original research files, funding authorizations signed by Reed Whitfield, internal progress reports showing clinical trial results that should have made headlines, and a chain of emails between Tanner Weston and 2 board members dating from the last 8 months of Reed's life. Reed had been deteriorating faster than anyone outside the family knew. His short-term memory was unreliable. His ability to track a document from the first page to the last was gone. Tanner had known exactly how to use that. The emails were careful, professional, the kind of language that sounds like legitimate business communication until you read it twice and understand what's actually being coordinated. Tanner had coached the board members on presentation order, on which documents to show Reed first to establish context, on how to frame the Helix shutdown as a financial necessity, a painful but responsible decision. The kind of thing a founder would want. Reed had signed it. He hadn't understood what he was signing. There was one more email at the bottom of the chain, dated 4 months before Reed died. Tanner to a single board member, not copied to anyone else. It said the recurring revenue model only holds if there is no cure in the market. Make sure he understands that Helix represents an existential risk to the pharmaceutical division. Use whatever framing is necessary. Sloan read that email 3 times. Then she closed her laptop, sat in the dark for a while, and figured out what she was going to do about it. I knew none of this while it was happening. I was at the console in the barn, running the upload sequence and watching the percentage tick upward, 61%, 64%. The cooling units hummed. Cole's monitor showed a steady rhythm. I checked the perimeter camera on my phone every 20 minutes. The gray sedan was gone from the access road. I told myself that was a good sign. I told myself she'd decided to walk away, call her security team in the morning, let the professionals handle it. I was wrong. On the second night, I drove in from a different direction and didn't see anything unusual. I ran 4 hours of processing and went home before dawn, 71%. On the third night, I was 20 minutes into the session when the outer perimeter alarm tripped. I checked the feed. 3 black SUVs on the county road running without headlights, moving slow. Staged approach, the kind you use when you want to box in an exit before the subject knows you're there. I recognized the formation. Tanner's team used it. The building's internal AI had flagged my handwriting and keystroke cadence from the whiteboard 2 nights earlier. It had taken his security analysts 6 minutes to identify me from the biometric database and another few hours to trace my truck registration to the Hadley property address. Tanner had waited until the 3rd night to move. He wanted to catch me with the servers running, the data mid-upload, the evidence undeniable. I looked at the console. 87%. I locked the outer doors, pulled up the upload parameters, and started typing. The perimeter alarm tripped again. They were at the fence line now, maybe 3 minutes out. I heard boots on gravel, then a second set, then a third, 88%. I kept typing. The barn doors came open with a crack of metal and a sweep of cold air. Flashlight beams cut across the server racks, across Cole's glass room, across my face. Tanner Weston walked in. He was in a dark suit, no tie. The way he looked when he'd been pulled out of bed for something that couldn't wait. 2 contractors flanked him, both armed. 2 more positioned at the door behind him. He looked at the servers. He looked at Cole. He looked at me. Then he smiled. The slow, settled kind of smile that means the outcome is already decided in his mind and this is just the last formality. Miles, he said. Or is it Brooks tonight? I stood up from the console and put myself between him and Cole's room. The upload needs 13 more minutes, I said. Let it finish. He shook his head, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Everything in this barn is Nexus property, he said. The servers, the algorithm, the research. You've been running unauthorized access on our infrastructure for 3 years. That's federal territory. He pulled up an application on his phone. I'm terminating the server authorization right now. Everything goes dark. He entered the override command. Nothing happened. He looked at the screen, entered it again. The servers kept humming. The progress bar kept moving. 89%. Tanner stared at his phone. For the first time that night, the smile dropped. The override's been blocked, said a voice from the far end of the barn. Sloane Whitfield stepped out from behind the rear server rack. She'd come in through the equipment door 2 hours before Tanner's convoy arrived. She'd been standing in the dark, waiting. She looked at Tanner the way you look at a problem you've already solved. Tanner turned slowly. He stared at her for a long moment without speaking. Ims. Whitfield. His voice was flat, controlled. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you, she said. But here we are. She was holding her phone in her left hand, screen facing up. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't moving toward him. She just stood there at the end of the barn like she'd been there all along, which she had. Tanner looked at his contractors. The 2 at the door shifted their weight. The 2 flanking him stayed still, but their eyes moved to Sloane, then back to him, waiting for a read. You've made a serious mistake tonight, Tanner said. Whatever you think you found, whatever story you've built around this, you need to understand what you're stepping into. The board authorized the Helix shutdown. The board authorized the termination. Everything that happened 9 years ago was within the scope of my operational authority and fully documented. I read the documentation, Sloane said. I also read the emails that landed. I could see it in the half-second pause before Tanner responded. He hadn't expected that. What emails, he said. Not a question. A test. The ones where you coached the board on how to walk my father through a document he didn't have the capacity to understand. The ones where you told them to frame Helix as an existential risk to the pharmaceutical division. The ones you sent from your personal account because you knew enough not to use company servers. She looked at him. Nora found them on the archive partition you forgot to wipe. Tanner set his jaw. Your niece is a 17-year-old intern. Anything she accessed outside her authorized scope is inadmissible and potentially grounds for its own legal action. She accessed a legacy archive folder during the course of her assigned duties. Sloane said, the deletion logs show your credentials initiated the wipe attempts, 3 of them, over 2 years. You just didn't know the right protection protocol on those servers. Our IT team built that in 2014. My father approved it. She tilted her phone slightly. The FBI field office in Austin received the full file package at 11:47 tonight. The SEC audit on your personal and LLC accounts went live at midnight. The Helix Orlatum folder, the email chain, a full accounting of the secondary grid access logs, and a recording of everything you've said in this building tonight. The barn was quiet except for the hum of the cooling units and the soft rhythm of Cole's monitor. Tanner looked at his contractors again. The calculation was visible on his face. 4 armed men, 2 unarmed civilians, no witnesses outside this building. He was running the math. Don't, Sloane said. Her voice didn't change. Your phones have been on a mirrored network since you crossed the county line. Every communication in or out of this property for the last 2 hours is logged. If you walk out of here tonight without incident, you face federal fraud charges, elder financial abuse, and corporate misconduct. That's 8 to 12 years with a good lawyer. If anything else happens in this barn, it becomes something much worse. You're 57 years old, Tanner. Pick the version you can survive. I wasn't watching Tanner at that point. I was watching the console. 91%. One of the contractors lowered his weapon about 2 inches. Not all the way, but 2 inches. The other one looked at the floor. They were professionals, not loyalists. There's a difference. Professionals do a cost-benefit calculation, and Sloane had just changed the numbers. Tanner stood there for what felt like a full minute. He was a man who had spent 9 years being the smartest person in every room. He was used to having more information than anyone else, more preparation, more leverage. Tonight he'd walked into a barn and found out someone had done his job better than he had. He put his phone in his jacket pocket. "You'll hear from my attorneys," he said. "I expect so," Sloan said. "The board meeting is at 7 a.m. You're welcome to attend." "I wouldn't recommend it, but you're welcome to." Tanner turned and walked out. His contractors followed. The barn doors closed behind them. I heard the SUVs start up on the gravel road, heard them pull out and drive north toward the highway. Then it was just the hum of the servers and Cole's monitor and the sound of my own breathing. 93%. I turned back to the console. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I'd expected them to be shaking. 3 years of building toward this, and now the only thing between me and the finish line was a progress bar in about 6 minutes. Sloan walked over and stood a few feet away from the console. She didn't say anything for a while. She looked at Cole through the glass. He'd slept through all of it. "How long has he been here?" she asked. 14 months in the barn. Before that, a converted storage unit near the airport. The setup wasn't as stable. She nodded. "And the Nexus grid access?" "How long?" 3 years off the secondary cooling loop. Never more than 4 hours at a stretch, never during peak monitoring windows. She was quiet again. "You could have come to me," she said. "You'd been CEO for 8 months when I started. You were inheriting a $2.8 billion company with a board you didn't fully control yet. I had a falsified misconduct record and no documentation. You would have had to choose between taking my word and destabilizing your first year." I looked at the screen, 95%. I didn't think that was a fair ask. She didn't argue with that. "The email about my father," she said. "Did you know?" I suspected Tanner had leveraged the illness. I didn't know the details. I couldn't prove anything, so I stopped trying to prove it and focused on what I could control. She looked at Cole again. "He looks like you. Stubborn jaw," I said. His mother always said that. 96%. The cooling units shifted into a higher gear as the processors hit peak load. The monitors flickered once, then settled. I leaned forward and started entering the final sequence commands, the ones that would lock the algorithm to Cole's specific neural signature and initiate the first reconstruction cycle. The 97%. I had been building toward this for 9 years. 6 years of research at Nexus, 2 years of legal dead ends, 3 years of mopping floors and sleeping 4 hours a night and watching my son get thinner and paler and quieter. All of it came down to this progress bar in a barn in South Austin at 1:40 in the morning, 98%. Sloan didn't say anything. She just stood there. 99%. I held my breath. 100%. The progress bar filled and held. The screen shifted from the upload interface to a new display, a real-time neural mapping grid showing Cole's brain activity in slow, measured pulses of blue and green. The algorithm was running, the reconstruction cycle had started. Then the monitor inside Cole's room changed tone, not an alarm, the opposite. The erratic rhythm that had been his baseline for the past 14 months, the one I'd learned to read like a second heartbeat, smoothed out into something clean and regular. The neural stabilization protocols were working. The degraded pathways were being mapped, flagged, queued for reconstruction. I stood at the glass and watched the readout for a long time without moving. Sloan stayed back. She didn't say anything. She understood, I think, that this wasn't a moment that needed words. Cole didn't wake up. He just lay there, breathing slowly, looking smaller than a 9-year-old should look. But the numbers on the monitor were the best numbers I'd seen in 3 years. The reconstruction index was already climbing. I pressed my hand flat against the glass I had promised him, 100 times, in 100 different ways, in the dark of that barn when he was awake and scared and asking me questions I didn't have good answers to. I had promised him we were going to fix it, that the thing growing in his brain was not going to win, that his father had built something that could stop it, and I just needed a little more time. I don't cry easily, haven't since his mother passed. But standing there with my hand on that glass, watching those numbers climb, I came pretty close. I took a breath, stepped back, turned to Sloan. "It's working," I said. She nodded. "I can see that." We stood there a moment longer. Then she said, "I need to get back to the city. The board meeting is in 5 hours and I have preparation to do." She looked at me directly. "You should know I'm going to present the full Helix research to the board this morning. The original files, the clinical data, everything Nora pulled from the archive. I'm going to propose a formal reinstatement of the project under the Nexus Medical Division." I looked at her. "The pharmaceutical division will fight it. The pharmaceutical division is about to lose 3 of its board allies before 7 a.m., she said. "I reached out to them tonight after I read the emails. 2 of them have families. Neither one wanted to be in the same sentence as elder financial abuse when the FBI starts pulling threads. They'll resign before the meeting starts," she said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Matter of fact, already done. You moved fast, I said. You spent 9 years on this, she said. The least I can do is move fast. She picked up her jacket from the stool near the rear server rack, checked her phone once, and walked toward the equipment door. Then she stopped and turned back. One more thing, she said. The misconduct report, the one Tanner used to terminate you. I pulled your original personnel file tonight before I drove out here. There's nothing in the source documentation that supports the allegations. It was fabricated, start to finish. I'll have HR formally expunge it by end of business today. I didn't say anything for a second. 9 years of carrying that. 9 years of knowing it was false and being unable to prove it to anyone who had the power to do anything about it. Thank you, I said. She nodded once and left. I heard her car on the gravel road, the sound fading south toward the highway. Then it was just me and the servers and Cole and the slow, steady beep of a monitor showing numbers that meant my son was going to be okay. I sat down in the chair at the console and stayed there until the sun came up. The board meeting lasted 49 minutes. I wasn't there for it. I was at the barn watching Cole's raidouts and running diagnostics on the algorithm. Sloan sent me a text at 7:52 a.m. that said done. 3 resignations before the meeting. Full reinstatement of Helix approved. 6-1 Tanner's access terminated at midnight. FBI picked him up at his house at 6 a.m. I read it twice, set the phone face down on the console. Looked at Cole through the glass. 6 months of legal and regulatory process followed. I won't pretend it was simple. The SEC investigation into Tanner's financials turned up accounts and arrangements that surprised even Sloan. The 2 board members who resigned cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for reduced exposure. Tanner's attorneys were good, but the email chain was unambiguous, and the elder abuse statutes in Texas carry weight when the victim is a founder and the amounts involved run into the hundreds of millions. He took a plea in the end, avoided trial. The sentencing was set for the following spring. The FDA fast-tracked Project Helix into Phase 2 clinical trials 4 months after the board meeting. The announcement ran in 3 major biotech publications and got picked up by the general press. Sloan handled the public side of it with the kind of precision that reminded me why she ran a $2.8 billion company at 38T. She knew what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. I came on as Chief Science Officer of the Nexus Medical Division the same week the trials launched. It was strange, walking back into that building with a different badge. Same elevator, same floors, different reason for being there. The night crew still worked the building. I recognized 2 of them from my time on the crew. Neither one knew who I had been. I didn't explain. Cole was released from the medical bay 6 weeks after the upload completed. The reconstruction index had reached 94% by then, which the outside neurologists we brought in said was beyond what they thought the algorithm could achieve in that time frame. I told them the algorithm had been running on suboptimal hardware for 3 years and was finally getting the processing power it was designed for. They wrote it up in their preliminary report as a remarkable clinical outcome. I called it my son coming home. We moved into a house in South Austin, a real one this time, with a yard and a school 3 blocks away. Cole picked the bedroom with the window that faced the backyard. He spent the first weekend arranging things on his shelves with the kind of serious concentration that 9-year-olds bring to important decisions. On the 3rd night in the new house, I sat at the kitchen table after he'd gone to bed and looked at the backyard through the window for a long time. No monitors, no server hum, no perimeter alarms, just quiet. Cole started school in September, 3rd grade. He'd missed almost 2 full years and was behind in reading but ahead in math. And according to his teacher, unusually good at explaining things to other kids who didn't understand them. She said he had a lot of patience for a 9-year-old. I told her he'd had a lot of practice waiting. The first parent-teacher night was a Tuesday. I sat in a small plastic chair across from his teacher, and she told me Cole was doing well, adjusting well, making friends. Normal things. The kind of things you stop taking for granted when you've spent 3 years not being sure you'd ever hear them. On the way home, Cole asked me what my new job was. I'd been at Nexus for 2 months by then and hadn't explained it in any detail. He knew I wasn't mopping floors anymore, which he seemed to consider an improvement. I told him I was a scientist, that I worked on treatments for kids with brain diseases, that the work I'd been doing for the past few years was now being used to help other families going through what we'd gone through. He thought about that for about half a block. Is that why you were always up so late? He asked. Yeah, I said. That's why. He nodded like that. Settled something he'd been wondering about for a while. Then he asked if we could get food on the way home. We got burgers. Sat in the truck in the parking lot and ate them. Cole talked about a kid at school named Freddie who had a dog that could open doors. I listened and ate my food and thought about the fact that 6 months ago I would have given almost anything for a night this ordinary. A few weeks later, I came home from work and found a drawing on the kitchen table. Cole had left it there before going to a neighbor kid's house for the afternoon. He'd drawn it in crayon on a piece of construction paper. On the left side was a figure in a blue uniform, pushing a cart. On the right side was a glass box with a stick figure inside it, giving a thumbs up. Above it all, in large, uneven letters, it said, Date A Fingsdit IT. I put it on the refrigerator. It's still there. Sloan and I have a working relationship that's become something closer to a real friendship over the past several months. We don't talk about the barn much. We don't need to. There's a shorthand that develops between people who've been through something like that, a mutual understanding that doesn't require a lot of maintenance. She told me once, on a slow afternoon in the office, that she'd been thinking about what made her follow me that first night instead of calling security. She said she didn't have a clean answer. She said something about the way I'd stood in front of the whiteboard felt different from how a spy or a hacker stands. Like someone who recognized something, not someone casing it. I told her I thought she'd made a good call. She said she thought so too. The Phase 2 trials are running well. We have 34 patients enrolled across 4 sites. The early outcomes are consistent with what I saw with Cole, which means they're better than anything else currently in the market for this class of disease. The pharmaceutical division is adjusting its model. They don't have a choice. When the data is this clear, you either get in front of it or it runs over you. There are families in the trial right now who are sitting where I sat 3 years ago. Parents who are doing the math on treatment costs and timelines and trying to hold it together in front of their kids. Parents who have been told this is manageable but not curable, that the best they can do is slow it down. They don't know yet that the math is about to change. I think about that a lot, not in a way that needs to be said out loud, just in the background, while I'm working, while I'm driving Cole to school, while I'm sitting at my desk in an office on the 42nd floor of a building I used to clean at night. The work I started 9 years ago is going to reach people who need it. That's the thing that was always true, even when I was mopping floors and running uploads in a barn and not sure if I was going to get there in time. It was always going to be true, it just needed someone to let it happen. If this story hit close to home, hit like and pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. There are a lot of people out there who built something real and got pushed out before it could matter. And there are a lot of kids counting on fathers who refuse to quit. Drop a comment below if you were in Miles's position. How far would you go? Subscribe for more stories like this one.